On a morning in February 2022, a small group of officials in Washington, Brussels, and London announced something years of diplomacy had never managed to do. They began cutting one of the two largest military powers on Earth off from the global financial system. Over the following weeks, with nothing more than paperwork. Russian banks found themselves shut out of the messaging network banks use to coordinate payments across borders. Not through confrontation, not through negotiation, through a regulatory decision executed in a matter of weeks. And that's not even the most expensive example in this story. In 2014, a French bank, one of the largest in the world, was forced to pay nearly $9 billion for moving money tied to governments the United States had already blacklisted, through a financial system that, however briefly, touched American jurisdiction. That was enough. Washington had jurisdiction, had leverage, had the final word. That's the paradox at the center of this story. The most powerful instrument in modern geopolitics isn't a missile, a fleet, or an army. It's a wire transfer, and the system that decides whether it goes through. Compare the two tools side by side, and the mismatch is almost comic. A single American aircraft carrier costs roughly $13 billion to build and takes the better part of a decade, keel to commissioning. The tool this video is about costs, in practical terms, almost nothing to deploy. It requires nothing but a name, added to a public list almost nobody thinks to check, inside a database that most people don't even know exists. So how did the United States turn something as mundane as a payment message into a tool capable of bringing entire economies to their knees? To understand how sanctions became America's most powerful weapon, you have to go back to a hostage crisis in Tehran, a piece of emergency legislation almost nobody remembers, and a currency that just happens to sit underneath almost every transaction on Earth. But to understand why this matters, you first need to see exactly where it sits on the map. To find the origin of this system, you don't start with a war. You start with 52 hostages, a president in Washington running out of options, and a piece of paper that would freeze a nation's wealth. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took its staff hostage. 10 days later, with no military option that didn't risk their lives, President Jimmy Carter reached for a different kind of weapon. He signed Executive Order 12,170, freezing every Iranian government asset within reach of American jurisdiction. Deposits, gold, property, even holdings sitting in the overseas branches of American banks, thousands of miles from Washington. Estimates of what was actually frozen vary depending on how you count it. Liquid deposits alone were under $6 billion, but once you include gold, property, and every overseas holding tied to Iran's government, the number climbs closer to 12 billion. Either way, the message was the same. An American president could reach into a bank vault on the other side of the planet and simply switch it off. The standoff wasn't resolved by force. It was resolved by paperwork. The Algiers Accords, signed in January of 1981, which unwound the freeze, released the hostages, and created a permanent tribunal in The Hague just to sort out the competing claims. Even the resolution of a financial weapon, it turned out, needed its own bureaucracy. That power didn't come from nowhere. 2 years earlier, in 1977, Congress had quietly passed the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. It replaced a World War I-era law, the Trading with the Enemy Act, which had been written to police commerce with Germany in 1917 and had grown far too blunt for a Cold War world where the president was declaring emergencies that somehow never seemed to end. Congress's fix was to narrow the scope but sharpen the blade. IEEPA gave the president the authority to declare a national emergency over any unusual and extraordinary threat originating abroad, and to freeze, block, or prohibit economic transactions connected to it. No new war powers, no new army, just a legal switch that, once flipped, could isolate a government from the global financial system almost instantly. And that switch, once installed, is rarely put away. The national emergency declared over Iran in 1979 has been renewed by every president since, year after year, for more than 4 decades. The single oldest state of emergency in American history, and far from the only one still on the books. The agency built to operate that switch already existed, even if almost nobody had heard of it. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, traces back to December of 1950, when the United States blocked Chinese and North Korean assets after China entered the Korean War. For decades, it stayed a narrow, almost bureaucratic operation, mostly known for enforcing the Cuba embargo. Then came Iran in 1979, then Libya. Then, program by program, decade by decade, an office built to freeze one country's assets grew into something categorically different. By the turn of the millennium, OFAC was overseeing roughly 900 sanctioned individuals and entities under around 70 distinct legal authorities. By 2021, that number had grown by more than 900%, over 9,000 sanctioned parties, backed by more than 170 separate legal authorities, according to the Treasury's own internal review. Its official country and program listing counts more than 30 active sanctions regimes. The same small office, a different order of magnitude entirely. And the penalties behind that list aren't symbolic. Civil violations can cost a company the greater of several $100,000 per violation, or twice the value of the transaction itself, whichever numbers are higher. Willful criminal violations carry fines up to $1 million and prison sentences of up to 20 years. For a company processing thousands of transactions a year, a single systemic violation can multiply into an existential number very quickly. Those 30-plus programs aren't a single, uniform wall. Some are comprehensive embargoes, virtually all trade and financial dealings prohibited outright, the treatment historically reserved for a small handful of countries like Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. Most of the list, though, is built from targeted programs instead. Narrower restrictions aimed at specific individuals, companies, or sectors, layered on top of thematic categories that have nothing to do with any single country at all. Counter-terrorism financing, narcotics trafficking, cyber-enabled crime, human rights abuses. A government can end up on Washington's radar not because of who it is, but because of what a handful of its citizens or state-linked companies did. That layering matters because it's what makes the system flexible enough to use constantly, rather than only in moments of outright war. A full embargo is a blunt instrument, reserved for the rarest cases. A targeted designation, one company, one individual, one vessel, can be added or removed in a single afternoon, which is exactly why the sanctioned parties list has grown by the thousands over the past 2 decades, instead of staying fixed at a handful of pariah states. But a legal switch is only as powerful as the wire it's connected to. And this is where the story stops being about Washington and starts being about something almost nobody thinks about when they send money abroad: which currency the world actually runs on. Roughly 57% of every dollar held in central bank reserves worldwide is, unsurprisingly, in dollars, more than the next four largest reserve currencies combined. Close to 90% of all foreign exchange trades on Earth have the dollar on one side of the transaction, out of a market that turns over close to $10 trillion a day. Over half of global trade is invoiced in it, priced in it, even when neither the buyer nor the seller is American. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's the plumbing underneath nearly every cross-border transaction on the planet. In the same way electricity is the plumbing underneath nearly every device you own, invisible until someone controls the switch. And plumbing needs pipes. A huge share of the dollars that move internationally, even between two banks that have nothing to do with the United States, ultimately depends on American clearing infrastructure. At the core of it sit two enormous systems: Fedwire, run by the Federal Reserve, and CHIPS, a privately operated network that alone settles a daily average of just over $2 trillion. That's not $2 trillion a year, that's $2 trillion every single day, 500,000 payments a day, moving through pipes that sit on American soil, under American law. Here's the part that turns plumbing into power. Because that pipe sits inside the United States, US regulators claim jurisdiction over what flows through it, even when both parties on either end are foreign. A bank in Paris paying a bank in Dubai in dollars for oil that never sees an American port can still route its payment through an American correspondent bank for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, American law attaches. This is the mechanism banking lawyers call correspondent banking, and it exists for an entirely mundane reason. Most banks outside the United States don't hold direct accounts at the Federal Reserve, so when they need to settle a dollar payment, they route it through a partner bank that does, usually a large American institution sitting in New York. That routing step is invisible to the two original parties. Neither the Parisian bank nor the Dubai bank ever intended to touch American soil. But for the seconds it takes that payment to clear through its American intermediary, it is, legally, an American transaction, and American sanctions law follows it the entire way. That single design choice, dollar dominance plus American-controlled clearing, is what turns an obscure Treasury office into the most feared regulator on Earth. Not because the United States has more soldiers, because almost every serious economy on the planet still needs to move money in dollars, and an enormous share of those movements ultimately depends, however briefly, on American financial infrastructure. And that geography hides a fragility almost nobody talks about, until it breaks. The fragility starts with a system almost nobody outside banking has ever heard of, and almost everybody inside banking cannot function without. It's called SWIFT, and the first thing to understand about it is what it is not. SWIFT doesn't move money. It's a messaging system based in Belgium under Belgian and European regulation. A secure, standardized way for one bank to tell another bank, send this amount to this account for this reason. More than 11,000 institutions in over 200 countries rely on it, sending on the order of 60 million of these messages on an average day. Money itself still moves through separate settlement systems. SWIFT is just the instruction that tells the money where to go, the addressing system of global finance, not the delivery truck. SWIFT itself is structured as a cooperative, owned by its member banks, and overseen primarily by the National Bank of Belgium, working alongside a broader group of central banks, including several outside Europe, through a formal oversight arrangement. That structure matters because it means SWIFT does not, on its own, decide who gets cut off. When governments call for a ban, SWIFT's own public position has consistently been that sanctions decisions rest with elected governments and regulators, not with the cooperative itself. It complies with the law it's subject to, rather than setting policy independently. Which is precisely why a decision made in Washington, London, and Brussels can still result in a Belgian non-profit switching off access for banks on the other side of the world. Which raises an obvious question. If it's just messaging, why would getting cut off from it cripple an economy? Because in modern banking, an instruction you can't send is a payment you can't make. Without SWIFT, a bank doesn't lose the ability to move money in theory. It loses the shared, trusted, standardized language every other bank on earth uses to receive that money safely. What's left are slow, expensive, unreliable workarounds, phone calls, faxes, one-off bilateral arrangements that most global banks won't even bother setting up. Cut off from the message, you're functionally cut off from the system. On February 26, 2022, 2 days after Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada announced they would do exactly that: remove selected Russian banks from SWIFT. On March 2nd, the European Union made it official. 7 institutions cut off, effective within 10 days. VTB, Bank Odkrytia, Novicombank, Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossiya, Sovcombank, and VEB. But here's the detail that most coverage at the time glossed over. The detail that turns this from a simple punishment into a case study in how sanctions actually work. 2 of Russia's largest financial institutions, Sberbank and Gazprom Bank, the ones processing the bulk of the country's oil and gas payments to Europe, were deliberately left off that first list. Europe still needed Russian energy. In 2021, Russia supplied around 40% of all the pipeline gas the European Union imported. Washington and Brussels understood something crucial. Total severance would hurt the sanctioning countries almost as much as the target. That's the paradox sitting at the heart of every sanctions campaign. The weapon is powerful precisely because of interdependence. But that same interdependence limits how far you can actually swing it without wounding yourself in the process. It would take years of additional sanctions packages, through 2024 and beyond, before institutions like Gazprom Bank were fully cut off. And only once Europe had rebuilt enough of its energy supply chain to absorb the shock. Russia didn't just absorb the blow either. It had been building a backup system since 2014, called SPFS, its own financial messaging network, built in the years following the annexation of Crimea. By the end of 2024, it had grown to nearly 600 participating institutions, including well over 100 foreign banks across 24 countries, with message volume climbing by roughly a quarter year over year. It's real. It works within its limits, between the banks willing to use it. But scale is everything here. 11,000 institutions on one network, a few hundred on the other. SPFS remains a fraction of SWIFT's size, dependent on pre-existing banking relationships, and increasingly risky for any foreign bank to join, because the same treasury that removed Russia from SWIFT started warning by late 2024 that connecting to Russia's alternative was itself a red flag for secondary sanctions. Which brings us to the second half of this mechanism, the part that explains why almost no bank on earth is willing to test Washington's patience. In 2014, a major French bank, BNP Paribas, pleaded guilty to a scheme that, on paper, looked almost bureaucratic, stripping identifying information from payment messages tied to Sudan, Iran, and Cuba, so the transactions would clear through the American financial system without triggering a red flag. Nearly 4,000 transactions over several years. The penalty? Just under $9 billion, the largest sanctions settlement in history, split across a criminal forfeiture, a treasury settlement, a Federal Reserve penalty, and a state regulator fine, plus a one-year suspension of the bank's ability to clear US dollars for entire lines of its business. For a global bank, a suspension like that isn't a fine. It's closer to a partial death sentence. That case was not an isolated example. It was the template. A British bank paid roughly $670 million in 2012, and then, having apparently not learned the lesson fully, another billion plus in 2019 for continuing violations. A British headquartered bank with deep roots in Asia paid nearly $2 billion that same year, 2012, over money laundering and sanctions failures tied to Mexico and elsewhere, 2 years before the French case, and still not enough to change the industry's habits. A German lender paid close to $1.5 billion in 2015 over conduct connected to Iran, Sudan, Burma, and Cuba. Different banks, different headquarters, different sanctioned countries, sometimes different underlying charges layered together, but at the core of nearly every one of them sat the same vulnerability. A dollar transaction that passed through the American financial system on behalf of someone Washington had already blacklisted. Lay those cases out on a timeline, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. Roughly one blockbuster settlement every year or two for the better part of a decade, each one large enough to make front-page news in the financial press and small enough, relative to the bank's total balance sheet, that none of them actually collapsed. Whether by design or effect, the penalties landed heavy enough to terrify every compliance department on the planet, but not so heavy that they destabilized the very financial system the sanctions regime depends on to function. A dead bank can't police anyone's transactions. A frightened one polices them obsessively. And the lesson landed everywhere in global finance instantly. It doesn't matter where your bank is headquartered. If a dollar transaction passes through the American financial system, US jurisdiction can attach, regardless of where the underlying deal began. That's what turns Washington's reach extraterritorial. Not just what US banks refuse to do, but what every bank on earth ends up policing on America's behalf, out of fear of becoming the next multi-billion-dollar example. Compliance departments at foreign banks run automated screening on every single transaction, checking counterparties against American sanctions lists before a single dollar moves. An army of private sector enforcers Washington never had to hire, train, or pay. There's an academic name for this pattern, and it's worth knowing because you'll recognize it everywhere once you see it. Political scientists Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman call it weaponized interdependence. Their argument is simple. In a globally networked economy, whoever controls the central hub, the one node everyone else's transaction has to pass through, gains two separate powers at once: a panopticon power, the ability to see every transaction flowing through that hub, and a choke point power, the ability to cut any single participant off from it entirely. SWIFT sits at the center of one such hub. The dollar clearing system sits at the center of another. The United States, as it happens, has enormous influence over both, and enforcement hasn't slowed since that first wave of billion-dollar settlements. More recent cases involve smaller institutions and individuals rather than global megabanks, but the penalties can still be severe. Industry trackers reported one 2025 enforcement action against an investment firm with a maximum assessed penalty north of $200 million for violations connected to Russia sanctions, precisely because the firm involved had made no voluntary disclosure and showed no sign of self-correction. The scale of the target changed, the logic didn't, which is the real mechanism behind every sanctions campaign you've ever read a headline about. It was never really about America's ability to block a transaction. It's about every other bank on the planet choosing to block it first, rather than risk finding out what happens if they don't. It's worth understanding briefly how a name actually lands on that list in the first place, because the process itself is part of what makes the weapon so flexible. A designation doesn't require a criminal conviction or even a public trial. Treasury analysts build an evidentiary case: intelligence reporting, financial records, corporate filings, showing that a person, company, or vessel meets the legal criteria under whichever executive order applies. Material support for a sanctioned government, ownership by a blocked entity, involvement in a targeted sector. Once that determination is made, the designation takes effect immediately upon publication. There's no waiting period for the rest of the world to catch up. A bank in Singapore or a shipping registry in Panama is expected to already be screening against the list in real time. The reverse process, getting removed, is far slower and far less certain. A designated party can petition for delisting, arguing changed circumstances or mistaken identity. But reviews can take years, and Treasury holds the burden of proof only in the loosest sense. Courts have historically given the executive branch wide deference on national security determinations. Add someone to the list in an afternoon. Remove them, if you're fortunate, in a few years. That asymmetry alone does enormous work in keeping companies compliant. The downside of being wrongly designated so dramatically outweighs the downside of overcautious compliance that most institutions choose to avoid entire countries and sectors rather than risk a single misjudged transaction. There's a release valve built into the same system, and it matters just as much as the block itself. Alongside every blanket prohibition, Treasury issues general licenses, narrow, pre-authorized exceptions that permit specific categories of otherwise prohibited activity: humanitarian food and medicine shipments, wind-down periods for existing contracts, energy transactions Washington doesn't want to fully choke off. Those licenses are what allowed Chevron, for a period of years, to maintain limited operations in Venezuela, even while the country's state oil company sat on the blocked list, and what let humanitarian organizations keep moving supplies into Afghanistan and Syria, even under years of some of the harshest sanctions on record. The weapon, in other words, isn't really binary. It's closer to a dial Treasury can turn: full embargo at one end, a handful of surgical exceptions carved into it at the other, which is exactly the kind of precision that makes it useful in situations far short of outright war. But the real story isn't what happens on the map. It's what happens to the money. Money doesn't stop moving just because a country gets sanctioned. It bends, it reroutes, it finds discounts, workarounds, and shadow markets. And nowhere is that more visible than in the story of Russian oil after February 2022. The G7, the European Union, and Australia built a mechanism designed to hurt Moscow's revenue without pulling Russian barrels off the market entirely, because removing that supply outright risked spiking global energy prices for everyone, including the countries imposing the sanctions. The tool, a price cap, set initially at $60 a barrel. Insurance and shipping services, almost all of them controlled by Western firms, would only be available for Russian crude sold at or below that ceiling. Sell above it, and you lose access to the tankers and insurers that make global oil trade possible. The European Union later lowered its own ceiling further, and for a time tied it to a moving formula, a fixed percentage below the market price of Russian crude rather than a flat number, while the wider G7 group held its own threshold steady, so the exact cap in force has shifted more than once as circumstances on the ground changed. That mechanism, refined over successive rounds, pushed Russia's federal oil and gas revenue down by roughly a quarter in a single year, falling to levels not seen since 2020, with oil and gas shrinking to their smallest share of the federal budget in 2 decades. Russia's own finance ministry posted a budget deficit that was the largest in nominal terms since 2006, and the highest as a share of GDP since 2020. But the number that matters just as much is the one that didn't move: Russian crude export volume. It stayed remarkably resilient, holding in the range of 4 to 5 million barrels a day. The sanctions didn't stop the oil from leaving port. They made it leave port for less money, and forced an entire shadow logistics network into existence to make that possible. Analysts call it the shadow fleet, aging tankers, often with obscured ownership and murky insurance, that grew from roughly 100 vessels in the weeks after the invasion to well over 300 within a few years. By some estimates, the average age of these vessels runs close to 2 decades, well above the roughly 14-year average for the global tanker fleet as a whole. These are ships nearing the end of their working lives, often uninsured by any recognized Western underwriter, taking on risks no legitimate insurer would touch. By some estimates, that fleet carries the majority of Russia's crude exports out of its Baltic ports alone. It works, but it works at a discount. At various points, Russian crude has traded more than $20 a barrel below the global benchmark price, though the size of that discount has swung considerably depending on the moment, which is, in effect, the price cap succeeding through the back door, not by stopping the oil, but by taxing every barrel that moves. Iran offers a mirror image of the same story, with a different buyer at the other end, and a longer history behind it. Tehran has lived under some form of American sanctions for the better part of 5 decades, dating back to that same 1979 hostage crisis that opened this story. After a snapback of United Nations sanctions restored a wide range of pre-2016 restrictions in the autumn of 2025, Iranian oil kept moving anyway, the overwhelming majority of it to independent Chinese refiners, using much the same playbook that has kept Russian barrels moving too. Ship-to-ship transfers off Malaysia and the Gulf, tankers renamed and reflagged mid-voyage, cargoes blended and relabeled before they ever reach a Chinese port. The discount on that oil has widened over time. At points, Iranian crude has sold more than $10 a barrel below the global benchmark, because the buyers willing to take on that much sanctions risk expect to be compensated for it. Sanctions, in other words, don't just cut off revenue. They impose something like a persistent tax on the trade that keeps flowing for as long as the sanctions remain in force. Iran's own fiscal math makes the scale of that tax obvious. To balance its government budget outright, Iran would need oil prices roughly double what its actual discounted exports are fetching. That gap doesn't disappear. It gets absorbed somewhere. In currency depreciation, in inflation, in a shrinking ability to fund subsidies and public spending. This is the part of sanctions that rarely makes it into a headline, because it doesn't happen in a single dramatic event. It's not a bank collapsing or a tanker seized at sea. It's a currency losing value a little every month, for years, until the erosion becomes the story on its own. Two smaller economies show what happens when that tax gets applied for even longer. North Korea has operated under a comprehensive American embargo for decades, cut off almost entirely from the dollar-based financial system, forcing its government towards smuggling, cyber theft, and barter arrangements just to acquire hard currency. Venezuela's state oil company has spent years cycling between full blacklisting and narrow revocable licenses that have, at different points, allowed companies like Chevron back into the country. A demonstration that Washington can dial sanctions up or down as a lever, not just an on-off switch. Both cases make the same point from opposite directions. The longer sanctions run, the more permanent the workarounds around them become, and the harder it gets to fully reverse the damage, even if the politics eventually change. Which brings us to the second-order effect, the one that should worry Washington more than any single evaded barrel. Every time this weapon gets used, it hands the targets of it, and the countries watching from the sidelines, a stronger incentive to build their way around it. Treasury's own internal review of its sanctions program, published in 2021, warned that adversaries and even some allies were already reducing their use of the dollar and their exposure to the American financial system, and that left unchecked, new payment systems and digital currencies built to diminish the dollar's global role could erode the very effectiveness sanctions depend on. China has spent over a decade building the infrastructure for exactly that. Its cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, has grown from around 200 participating institutions at launch in 2015 to well over 1,000, spanning more than 100 countries, moving on the order of $24 trillion worth of transactions in a single recent year. It's real, growing infrastructure. But it still leans on SWIFT's own messaging standards for much of its own traffic. The two systems signed a formal cooperation agreement rather than becoming rivals, and CIPS remains a fraction of the size of the network it's sometimes described as replacing. It's a parallel lane being built alongside the highway, not yet a replacement for it. A separate experiment goes further still. A multi-country digital currency platform, developed with early support from an international group of central banks, linking monetary authorities across China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. The project reached the point of processing live commercial transactions, at which stage the international group of central banks that had incubated it formally stepped back, describing the project as having graduated, leaving the participating central banks to continue operating it independently. Since its pilot phase began, it has processed on the order of $55 billion across roughly 4,000 transactions, almost entirely in Chinese digital currency. It's a genuine glimpse of what dollar-free settlement between willing partners could eventually look like, built specifically to route around correspondent banking, and by extension, around the exact choke point this video has spent the last 20 minutes explaining. In practical terms, a payment settled entirely within this architecture can avoid an American correspondent bank altogether, which means it can avoid American jurisdiction too. But $55 billion is a rounding error against the roughly $2 trillion that moves through American clearing infrastructure in a single day. To matter at global scale, a platform like this would need to grow by several orders of magnitude, and, just as important, would need trading partners outside its founding members, willing to hold and settle in a currency still subject to Beijing's capital controls. And a proposed alternative payment system among the BRICS nations remains, as of this telling, closer to a concept than a functioning network, demonstrated in prototype in Moscow, discussed at successive summits, with member governments still debating how existing national payment systems and digital currencies might eventually be linked. No unified BRICS payment network operates at global scale. When the countries building a system are still negotiating its basic architecture, that's usually the clearest signal of how far it actually is from existing. Stack every alternative up against each other: Chinese infrastructure, Russian messaging, a Gulf Asia digital currency bridge, and a BRICS platform that barely exists outside a conference room. And together, they still don't approach the density, the trust, or the sheer transactional volume of the network built around the dollar over the better part of a century. Building an alternative payment rail turns out to be the easy part. Convincing the rest of the world to actually trust it with their money is the part nobody has solved. So here's the honest state of the map. The dollar's share of global reserves has drifted down a little year over year. Alternative payment networks are real, growing, and no longer theoretical. But none of them, individually or combined, have come close to displacing the system Washington built its weapon on top of. The erosion is real, the collapse is not, at least not according to any data available at the time of this telling. Which means the United States is left holding something genuinely rare in the history of great powers, a weapon that gets more effective the more the rest of the world depends on the exact thing being weaponized, and less effective every time that dependence gives someone a reason to walk away. Which leaves us with one final question, the one that changes how you'll read the news from now on. So go back to that morning in February 2022 and to that French bank's $9 billion bill in 2014. Having traced the mechanism from a hostage crisis in Tehran to a shadow fleet in the Baltic, the explanation should be obvious. It was never really about a signature on a list. It's about three things stacked on top of each other: a legal switch built in the aftermath of a hostage crisis, a currency that sits underneath almost every serious transaction on the planet, and a piece of financial plumbing that happens to run through American soil. Remove any one of those three layers, and the weapon becomes dramatically weaker. Take away the dollar's dominance, and freezing an account somewhere else does far less. Take away control of the clearing pipes, and jurisdiction has a much harder time attaching. Take away the legal authority, and there's no switch to flip in the first place. For nearly half a century, all three have stayed in place at once, which is precisely why this tool has grown from a narrow embargo against a handful of countries into a system reaching into the finances of nations that never signed up to be part of it, enforced not by American agents abroad, but by foreign banks policing themselves out of fear. And that's the real answer to the question this video opened with. The most powerful weapon in modern geopolitics isn't powerful because Washington built something no one else could copy. It's powerful because the rest of the world, for decades, found it more useful to depend on the dollar than to build around it. Every sanctions campaign, every frozen account, every multi-billion-dollar bank settlement, all of it draws its force from that dependence, and none of it would carry anything close to the same global reach without it. Remove Iran's assets, remove Russia's banks, remove Sudan, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, dozens of others across 5 decades. Each case looks, on the surface, like a story about a single sanctioned country. Zoom out far enough, and it's really one continuous story about the architecture underneath all of them. Which is exactly why the story doesn't end here. Every time this weapon fires, it teaches the rest of the world the same lesson. Dependence on the dollar is not just a convenience, it's a vulnerability. Alternative payment networks, backup messaging systems, digital settlement platforms between central banks, none of them threaten American financial power at the time of this telling. But each one exists because someone, somewhere, decided that the convenience of the moment wasn't worth the exposure it created down the line. Treasury's own analysts said as much in writing in that 2021 review. The agency that wields the weapon also produced the clearest warning about its long-term limits. That's the strategic lesson underneath everything this video has traced. Coercive power built on network centrality is self-limiting by nature. The more essential a choke point becomes to enforcement, the more valuable it becomes to root around. And major sanctions campaigns have, again and again, strengthened the incentive to invest in exactly that. Iran, Russia, and China have each invested in different ways of reducing their exposure to the same network choke points. Shadow fleet logistics, backup messaging networks, parallel payment rails. And each case study didn't just cost the target country, it handed every future target a slightly more complete playbook for surviving the next one. So the next time a headline tells you a country has been cut off from the global financial system, you'll know what that sentence actually means. Not a blockade, not a bomb. A signature, a currency, and a pipe. And an entire planet still, for the moment, plugged into the same wall. Every empire in history has had a currency, a network, or a resource that gave it outsized leverage over everyone else. And every one of those advantages eventually eroded, usually slower than anyone predicted, and faster than anyone in power wanted to admit. Rome had its roads. Britain had its navy and its pound sterling. The United States, for the moment, has the dollar and the pipes it flows through. History doesn't suggest that advantage is permanent. It suggests only that nobody quite knows in advance how long, for the moment, turns out to last. That's how sanctions became America's most powerful weapon. The question worth sitting with is how much longer that stays true. If you want to understand the systems quietly shaping the news before it happens, subscribe to Meridian Theory, and we'll see you in the next briefing.